Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we journey not through the familiar corridors of Victorian drawing rooms, but across the warm sands of time to ancient Alexandria, where the Mediterranean laps against marble steps and the scent of frankincense mingles with salt air. Whether you're settling into bed with the day's worries finally quieting, or perhaps walking through your own evening ritual, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend these peaceful moments here with me. Please, make yourself comfortable. Perhaps share in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Are you watching the stars from your window? Or maybe you've dimmed the lights and let the world grow soft around you. These stories seem to find their way to us just when we need them most, don't they? Tonight I want to tell you about a woman whose name has echoed through millennia, yet whose true story, the quiet moments, the private fears, the weight of impossible choices, remains largely hidden beneath layers of myth and masculine interpretation. This is not the Cleopatra of Hollywood spectacle, but rather a more human story of a brilliant young woman thrust into power during one of history's most tumultuous periods, navigating a world where every decision carried the weight of an entire civilization. They could speak honestly about the burden of never being able to trust anyone completely. When Cleopatra bore Caesar's son, Caesarion, she experienced what countless women throughout history have known, the profound transformation that comes with motherhood. But for her, this joy came intertwined with political calculation in ways that would break most hearts. Every lullaby was a political statement. Every tender moment was shadowed by the knowledge that her child's very existence was a claim to power that could someday cost him his life. Picture her in the quiet hours before dawn, when even queens can be simply mothers, holding her sleeping child and wondering what kind of world she was creating for him. The weight of dynasty, the pressure of succession, the terrible mathematics of survival, all these concerns competed with the simple, overwhelming love that floods a mother's heart. This is where Cleopatra's story becomes most achingly human. She was not merely a queen maneuvering for political advantage, but a woman trying to secure her child's future in a world where royal children were often the first casualties of political change. Every decision she made from this point forward carried not just the weight of Egypt's fate, but the desperate love of a mother who knew that her enemies would not hesitate to destroy her child to prevent future challenges to their power. The palace walls that had once seemed protective now felt like a beautiful prison. Servants could be spies, food could be poisoned, and even playground games carried the potential for political misinterpretation. Imagine trying to give a child normalcy under such circumstances, trying to let him laugh and play while knowing that his every word might be reported to enemies who would twist innocent comments into evidence of sedition. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra found herself once again navigating treacherous political waters, but now with a child's life depending on her choices. The Roman world had fractured, and she needed new allies. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and one of the three men vying for control of Rome, represented both opportunity and enormous risk. Their famous meeting on the barge at Tarsus, Cleopatra dressed as Aphrodite, surrounded by luxury and spectacle, is often portrayed as pure seduction. But consider instead the careful calculation behind such theater. Antony expected to meet a desperate client queen begging for protection. Instead, Cleopatra arrived as an equal, demonstrating that Egypt's wealth and Egypt's queen were forces to be respected, not merely exploited. But beyond the political maneuvering lay something deeper. Both Cleopatra and Antony were people who had learned to perform power so completely that they struggled to remember who they were beneath the roles they played. In each other they found someone who understood the exhaustion that comes with constant performance, the loneliness of never being able to let down one's guard. Their relationship produced 3 children, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later young Ptolemy Philadelphus. With each birth, Cleopatra's joy was tempered by the growing certainty that she was creating not just a family but potential targets for Rome's ambitions. Every cradle song carried an undertone of farewell. Every bedtime story became a lesson in resilience and survival. As tensions with Octavian, soon to be Augustus, escalated toward inevitable war, Cleopatra faced the most terrible calculations any mother can imagine. She knew that defeat would likely mean death for her and her children. Victory might preserve their lives, but at costs she could hardly bear to contemplate. In the quiet moments between public appearances and military conferences, she must have stood at windows overlooking Alexandria's harbor, watching ships come and go, wondering if each sunset might be among her last in the city she loved. Did she walk through the great library touching scrolls that contained centuries of human knowledge, wondering who would preserve these treasures if her dynasty fell? The human details matter here, dear listener. History remembers the grand strategies and political alliances, but what of the smaller moments? Did she still sing lullabies to her youngest children? Did she continue teaching them Greek and Egyptian, preparing them for futures she could no longer guarantee? How does a mother explain to a child that their bedtime stories might be interrupted by war? Her eldest son Caesarion was now a teenager, old enough to understand the gravity of their situation. Imagine the conversations between mother and son, she trying to prepare him for leadership while protecting him from despair. He struggling with the terrible knowledge that his very existence made him a target for Rome's new master. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE represented more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of everything Cleopatra had built and fought to preserve. When the Egyptian fleet faltered and retreat became necessary, she faced a choice that would define her forever: abandon Antony to save Egypt, or maintain loyalty at the cost of her kingdom. She chose loyalty, but this decision came with a mother's anguish. Every league sailed away from the battle was another step toward an uncertain future for her children. Every day that passed brought Octavian's forces closer to Alexandria and her family closer to the terrible fate that awaited defeated royalty. In those final months, as Octavian's net tightened around Egypt, Cleopatra made what was perhaps her most human decision. She sent Caesarion away. Imagine that farewell. A mother embracing her eldest child for what she suspected would be the last time, whispering final words of love and guidance, trying to memorize his face, while giving him the strength to face an uncertain future without her. The other children, still young enough to possibly survive as curiosities rather than threats, remained with her. But every dawn brought new reports of Octavian's advance, and every sunset carried the weight of decisions no parent should have to make. When the end came, Cleopatra faced it not as the mythical seductress of legend, but as a woman who had spent 39 years carrying impossible burdens with grace and intelligence. The famous aspect, if it existed at all, was not a dramatic prop but a practical solution to an impossible problem. Consider her final days not as melodrama, but as the quiet conclusion to a life lived under extraordinary pressure. She had been pharaoh for 18 years. Had borne 4 children, had loved deeply, had seen friends become enemies and enemies occasionally become allies. She had spoken 9 languages, had been worshipped as a goddess and vilified as a witch, had commanded navies and negotiated with the most powerful men of her age. But in the end, she was simply a woman facing the same question that confronts us all. How do we maintain dignity and humanity when circumstances become impossible? How do we protect those we love when protection is no longer possible? Her last letters, we're told, concerned arrangements for her children's care. Even facing death, her thoughts turned not to her own legacy but to the welfare of the young lives she was leaving behind. This, perhaps more than any political achievement, reveals the true heart of Cleopatra. Not the queen of legend, but the mother who loved her children more than her own life. What became of those children tells us much about the world Cleopatra had fought to preserve. Caesarion, despite her efforts to save him, was eventually hunted down and killed, his Roman blood making him too dangerous to let live. The younger children survived to be paraded in Octavian's triumph, living symbols of Egypt's defeat. But here is where we find a glimmer of hope in this tragic tale. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter who bore her mother's name, eventually married Juba II of Numidia, and became a queen in her own right. In the coins and inscriptions from her reign we can see echoes of her mother's intelligence and dignity. She named her own son Ptolemy, keeping alive the memory of her family's ancient dynasty. Perhaps this was Cleopatra's true victory, not the preservation of political power, but the transmission of something deeper, the courage to lead with intelligence rather than mere force, the wisdom to understand one's people, and the strength to face impossible circumstances with dignity. As we reach the end of our journey tonight, dear listener, I invite you to consider what Cleopatra's story teaches us about the nature of power and the cost of greatness. She lived in a world where women's authority was always questioned, where every display of strength was interpreted as weakness, where intelligence was often mistaken for cunning. Yet she managed for nearly 2 decades to preserve Egypt's independence in an age when Roman legions were reshaping the Mediterranean world. She spoke to her people in their own language, protected their ancient traditions, and faced impossible choices with a grace that impressed even her enemies. Perhaps what strikes me most about Cleopatra's story is how thoroughly it has been rewritten by those who defeated her. The real woman, brilliant, multilingual, diplomatically skilled, genuinely concerned for her people's welfare, has been largely replaced by caricature. History, as they say, is written by the victors, and they rarely have incentive to preserve the humanity of those they conquer. But in the quiet spaces between the political narratives, in the archaeological fragments and contemporary accounts that survive, we can still glimpse the real person, a woman who loved her children, who worried about her people's future, who carried impossible burdens with remarkable grace, and who faced the end of her world with dignity intact. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to carry such responsibility, to know that your every decision affects not just your own life, but the lives of millions?